Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's conversation, Black Skin, White Mask at 70, a public conversation with Louis R. Gordon. My name is Corey Walker. I'm the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities and Director of the Program in African American Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues here at Wake Forest African American Studies, I want to thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a very special and intellectually engaging program. I'm pleased to be joined by a dear friend, mentor, comrade, and just all-around great person, Louis R. Gordon, for today's conversation. We'll begin by first introducing Professor Gordon, and then we'll have a public conversation around Black Skin, White Masks at 7 at the conclusion of our conversation. Louis Gordon is an Afro-Jewish philosopher, thinker, political thinker, educator, and musician, dedicated to struggles for dignity, freedom, and justice across the globe. His writings address human beings' relationships to reality and the many ways they abuse power in their attempt to avoid it. These evasions include dehumanizing practices ranging from racism to sexism to colonialism and anti-democracy. He has lectured and performed music over the past 3 decades on every continent except Antarctica. He speaks to communities in all walks of life, from those in the academic world to community centers, international political organizations to arts collectives and festivals, urban centers and remote villages, and from state dignitaries to workers' collectives and those who are incarcerated. An award-winning author and scholar, Louis Gordon has held distinguished academic appointments in the United States at such institutions as Brown University, Temple University, and Yale University. He's also held a number of distinguished appointments in other countries, including Brazil, France, Jamaica, India, the Netherlands, Portugal, South Africa, and the UK. He's lectured widely across the Caribbean and Latin America in his role as the first president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association, and in his recent role as honorary president of the Global Center for Advanced Studies. As a musician and a cook, he has integrated musical performance, dance, and food, including having cooked for celebrations, festivals, and a variety of communities, into many of his lectures. Gordon is currently professor and head of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, where he also holds affiliations in Judaic studies, Caribbean and Latinx studies, Asian and Asian American studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and global studies. Please join me in welcoming Louis R. Gordon.
Hey, Professor Walker, it's so great to see you. It's also such a delight connected to, look, for the audience, we're in the presence of one of the major scholars around not only Prince Hall and other issues in terms of Black religious thought, but, a whole part of my family was also part of Prince Hall. So I thank you for the work you do in that area.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
And for those who are curious, it's about the Freemasons.
And remember, it's a society with secrets, not a secret society.
Yeah.
So
Indeed.
Everything you want to know is out in public.
Indeed.
Well, let's begin. Black Skin, White Mask at 70, excuse me. Here is this text that erupts on the scene in 1952. Who is this Frantz Fanon behind this text?
Frantz Fanon. Well, the thing is, Frantz Fanon is one of those beautiful mixtures of an extraordinary, interesting life and a great thinker. We're talking about somebody who was born in 1925, the same year as Max Roach, Malik Al-Shabazz or Malcolm X, Patrice Lumumba. All right, so, the ancestors, the gods were just saying, yo, man, let's make some revolutionaries this year. And he died in 1961, December 6, 1961, at the age of 36. So we're talking about an extraordinary impact for somebody who lived a very short time. He was born in Martinique. He was an extraordinarily gifted young child. In fact, I often, when I talk about him, a nickname for him was Bergson.
Hmm.
And a lot of those who are listening may not really get what that means today, but in the French-speaking world, particularly in the first, up until World War II, the first really quarter going into towards the first half of the 20th century, in the French world, the attitude was there was Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and this is the French world, right? They should say Descartes, but this was at the point they would say Bergson. So he was metonymic or symbolic with philosophy. So to be calling a Black kid in the island of Martinique Bergson, this is no understatement about what the community thought of the intellect of that child. He was one of these people who was extraordinarily passionate. He was one of those people who was so sensitive that he literally took the position that injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. And this was to the point where he volunteered to fight in the French resistance in World War II. I'm cutting a lot out because I figure we'll get to those later. Was a twice decorated veteran. And, one of the reasons, when he went to fight in World War II, one of his lycée professors, the French system, the secondary school system's lycée, it's a more complex system, but the French, his professor in lycée said, why going to fight this white man's war? And Fanon was like, where there's a threat on humanity anywhere, where there's a threat to dignity, freedom, I'm going to be there. And well, he went out there, he fought. And along the way, there were so many indignities, as many know, that were unleashed on Black soldiers. The French are pretty self-righteous about saying, their racism wasn't it's this American thing, right? But, Black soldiers were sent back early in the hulls of ships with just crackers. And, that way people just see white soldiers coming back with victory. And there was so many indignities. And that same professor said to Fanon, yo, man, so what do you say about the war? Fanon was like, it's a white man's war. And, but he did not lose his fervor, the human spirit. He got involved in a lot of political action and went to France because he was a twice decorated vet, first to study to be a dentist. I used to crack up with that. One time, there's a joke I can't tell anymore. I was one time on a rooftop in Nairobi in a crowd, and I was like saying, good God, revolutionary dentist. You can imagine all the puns. And Feroz Manji, the person who invited me, was like, yo, he's a revolutionary and he's a dentist. So I was like, yo, man, I guess you get to the root of the problem. Uh-huh. But anyway, but he decided he wanted to do psychiatry. So he went and studied psychiatry, became a physician, eventually went on later. He went back to Martinique briefly, but ended up leaving. And interestingly enough, because when you say Fanon's name, people think about violence a lot. But one of the incidents that led to him leaving Martinique was that he began to investigate the death of a woman. He had her exhumed. And this is really tricky because Fanon had this very unusual problem. When he was 14, a woman was hit by a car. She was killed. And the autopsy was being conducted in the church, and he asked his friends to come check it out. And they're like, nah, man, I'm not down with that. Well, when Fanon did, he went and looked at it. He was disgusted, not at the gore. He was disgusted because he realized he lacked the capacity to separate the humanity of the person from the body. It was the indignity that disgusted him. So the idea that he became a medical doctor where he had to conduct autopsies already told you he was dealing with a demon. Indeed, one of his professors, when he said he was having trouble getting through anatomy, said, pretend it's a cat. Now, in a country like this one, the United States or a lot of northern countries, they love animals more than people, especially Black people. They'll be like, yo, what's up with that? But cats would say, hey, man, why not a mouse? And mouse would probably say, why not, whatever. But anyway, So the idea that he was trained to be a clinical psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist, a medical detective. He concluded the woman died from domestic violence, but none of the authorities would do anything. And so he got to a point where he realized he had to be in a bigger position of authority to intervene on matters such as those. So he went and became a chef de service, another way of saying to be the head of a large facility in the French-speaking world. I took him to Algeria, where, to make the story short, he got involved in the Algerian liberation struggle. And along the way, not only developed all kinds of unique techniques around therapy, but wrote philosophical works, medical works, organized, did all kinds of stuff. And man, without the internet, without assistance. Anyway, in that short time, he wrote quite a bit.
Yeah. And
created some of the classics that we have today. But as you mentioned, we're talking about his first published book, which is Peau Noire Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask. So a lot of our conversation will go back to 1951 and to 1952 when it was published. And as I mentioned earlier, he died in 1961 from, of all things, leukemia, blood cancer. And we have to think about that, especially since he wrote a lot on the problem of biological notions of race. He was very critical of that. But ironically, this blood cancer was something he inherited. And interestingly enough, because he was a person of what people would call today mixed race from his white ancestry. Anyway, that's a brief introduction to who Fanon was.
Well, you provide us with an excellent segue into Black Skin, White Mask. It is his first text. It is, in many ways, it's a failed dissertation. Right? You're trying to figure out, what this text means, but this text provides us with an avenue of thinking with Fanon. And one thing that you've done, Louis, particularly in your book, What Fanon Said, you've actually gone through and did a close reading, an exegesis of the text. Talk to us a bit about placing this text in his thought and what this text provides us overall. What's the overall view of this text? And then we'll dive deeper into some aspects of it.
Sure. Well, the first thing is, I'll give some context to this text, okay? As I mentioned, Fanon was when he wrote the text, this was before he got his medical degree. In that system, you also write a thesis. But his professors were positivists. These are people who believed in physiological causes of mental illness. And Fanon took the position that I was wrong. Now, what animated him to write this text was a series of events. One of them, many in the audience would immediately identify with. You have to picture, here he is, he's being trained to be a psychiatrist. And therapy is to make you become at home with your environment. But he noticed that there would be people who would come to him, people in today's language of color, whether they're Arab or Black or, from the colonies, and they would be suffering. And he made a distinction between client and patient. A patient is someone you have accepted the idea the person is ill. But the client is somebody you're trying to figure out if the person is ill. And what he noticed was that a lot of these people are coming to him. And if someone is saying, I'm going through a lot of suffering from being called the N-word all the time, from being overlooked, degraded. And it's also women who are coming with these issues. Fanon realized a profound problem, which is, if you're upset about this, if you're suffering, ironically, it's because you're healthy. To make someone at home with their degradation That is unhealthy. And so he now had a conundrum, a challenge. Because if he were as a psychiatrist to make this person feel good about living in a racist, sexist society, he would in fact be committing a form of violence to their existence. So he realized that the issue was for them to be politically active, because even if they fail in their struggles, they have greater self-respect for trying. So this was the initial thing, but it has a deeper issue, a deeper question, which is because he was raising the problem of the impact of colonialism and racism on human science, on psychiatry itself. Because what he was identifying was a sort of complicity of psychiatry with colonization. If you think about it, in the United States, for instance, there used to be a disease called drapetomania.
Yeah.
And think about it. There was a diagnosis of saying enslaved Black people were afflicted with the illness of wanting freedom. So that already tells you something's up.
Yeah.
So the thing is, that's one thing. But what Fanon was doing more than that. He was in effect creating two texts. And the original title was Sur la désaliénation de Noirs, on the disalienation of the Black, right? And that was the thesis, and he submitted it to Deschamps, his advisor, and they were like, hell no. Where's the psychophysics? Where are the nerves? Where's the, all this stuff? And they rejected it. And just for the audience to know, so 2 weeks later, he submitted another thesis. And it was on Friedreich's ataxia, which is a degenerative disease. And people always said, damn, he wrote another dissertation in 2 weeks. But Fanon is one of those people who's always doing more than one thing at the same time. So he was actually studying for a while this illness because he knew this was a great illness to study because, and I had a cousin who died from this illness as well. It's an illness where you're so degenerated that after a while you can only communicate through just blinking your eyes. And if he could show, which he did in that thesis, that there were people who were not mentally ill with Friedreich's ataxia, and some people who were, he's established that this is an example in which those who were mentally ill were not from a physiological cause because there were others who were not. But now, what is he going to do with Sur la désaliénation le Noir, of the Black? Well, his brother Joby read it and said, yo, man, when he read it, he said, it actually should be on the désaliénation of the Black and the White when he read it. But at that time, Fanon had published two pieces. One was a very famous piece. The English translation is available on the North African Syndrome, okay? Where he has, and he already has that writing flair, that challenge to style and so forth. He did, he wasn't writing in the kind of subordinate government manual style that we're taught to do in the academy. His writing itself would leap off the page into the humanity of the reader. And he also wrote a piece for L'Esprit called L'Expérience Vécue de Noir, the lived experience of the Black, and it created a stir. So folks were curious about this and put him in touch with Francis Janson. And Francis Janson, who was a protege of Jean-Paul Sartre, he was a French Jewish left intellectual. He basically was working with, Edition de Sceaux and loved the manuscript and called Fanon in, and said, so back in those days, you meet with a publisher. So Fanon met with him and, he's like, yo, man, I love the book. It's really cool, blah, blah, blah. And Fanon said, you mean it's not bad for a book written by a neg, huh? And, a lot of people don't know that's, it's the French way, right? And Janson looked at him and said, and went to the door and said, opened it and said, get out of my office. And Fanon smiled and said, I can work with you. He refused to be patronized. And so they worked on this book, and Janson said, you should change the title. And he said, to what? And he said, to Pour Noir ma book. So it was Francis Janson who said to do this. And it's interesting because you see here black skin, white mask. You could see the riff in what his brother Joby said, the alienation of the black and the white. And this is very important because understanding this title could give a clue to how so many people misunderstand this text. But nevertheless, if we move forward, in 1952, the book came out, and it's a book, it's one of those books where people are like, what is this? What is this? And of course, what is this has been a discussion going on over the next 70 years.
When you talk about the text and what is it and how we begin to understand it, you've written, Louis, about the idea of Fanon and the teleological suspension of disciplinarity. And what Fanon is doing is in opening up a new style of thinking. He's moving beyond just the disciplinary confines and dictates of Western reason. In many ways, he's confronting the unreason that's actually there. Talk to us a bit about the construction of that text and with reference to your idea of the teleological suspension of disciplinarity.
Okay, so for the audience, that's a lot. So I'm gonna first, the thing to bear in mind, remember earlier I said that he's addressing the very idea that the way we go about human science, in this case psychiatry, could be a colonial project, okay? And one of the things we should understand first and foremost about a colonial project is it's not just about the physical force of colonizing people, but it's more effectively done, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o would point out, through colonizing the mind, to get people to believe in their inferiority. But within it, it means it's an entire system that's not simply material in the everyday sense, but it's also epistemological or a knowledge level thing. One has, and many people, when they think about that, they think about objects of knowledge. So they would think about if you have concepts like, whether you call somebody the N-word or black or all the other words, but no, what Fanon observed is that it can be in the very implementation, in the method itself, right? How you go about doing it. And so there could be, despite good intentions, the very production of colonial relations and dehumanization. And this means that it requires a radical self-critique, but it also requires understanding throughout that colonialism is a lie. In other words, it's a lie masked as a truth. And you can see that masked point is in the title of the book, all right? So the first thing, if you think about the book is about already two lies. The first lie is the construction of the black as sealed in the skin, an epidermal schema in which there is no possibility, right? Some people call it ontological blackness, but that's a lie. People forget that part of it all. It's a lie. But then there's another lie, the mask, the white mask. And a lot of people confusedly think the book is about black people wearing white masks. No. The point is, white people have to convince themselves of their superiority to black people. And that is a mask. The white mask is what white people wear. There are black people who attempt to be white by trying to put on that mask. But fundamentally, that mask is what pushes white people above humanity, the superiority complex. And the black skin epidermal schema pushes black people below humanity. And you see the problem? If there's a mass, a lie that pushes a group above and a group below, Fanon asked, where the hell is humanity? And that's why Fanon says in the book rather poetically that Euromodern colonialism is the attempted murder of humanity. You see that structure. Now within it, that attempted murder uses every resource at disposal. And among them is the lie that I call disciplinary decadence, okay? It's the lie to treat its sciences as if they're complete, as if they're the end all be all on what we are. But the tricky thing is, in order to question them, one should not presuppose their intrinsic legitimacy. So that means then one cannot be a snob about disciplines. One cannot say, well, I'm the scientist, the religious scholar doesn't know what she or he or they are talking about, the literary scholar, the text, all of that stuff. No. Fanon has to say, even he, a well-trained psychiatrist, can't presume the intrinsic legitimacy of his knowledge. And so to do it, it's not just the methodological move. He also had to move into the rhetorical performance, right? There are people who say somehow that if you get poetic, if you engage popular culture, film, novels, if you in some way talk about peasants and the community conversation, you're compromising the scholarly integrity, the scientific rigor of what you do. But if Fanon is arguing that that scientific rigor, even philosophy, as you pointed out, right, who's, as Jasper says, is a long hymn to reason. If reason even has become unreasonable, then you need a more radical critique. So what Fanon was doing is a form of subversive, indirect writing in the text itself that created a form of paradoxical relationship. Because when you say the author, even though we know the author was Frantz Fanon, the text had an internal subject, the naive subject. That's the person who says, yo, man, I could fit in this system. It's just, we just need to make it fairer, the standard liberal critique, right? If we can make it, there's room for us. I can assimilate in this system, right? And then there's the other Fanon, the metacritic, the person who says, yo, you're trying to fit into the logic of a colonial rationalization. In other words, if you're going to go in there, you got to convince them that you can legitimately wear that white mask the way they wear the white mask, but you're going to confront a problem, which is even when they wear the white mask, they're lying. So that's just making you a double liar. So in that framework, he goes through these movements in such a way that he now has to suspend the intrinsic legitimacy of any science. That's what I mean by teleological suspension. But when he goes beyond them, he also has to have the fidelity, the commitment, the love to communicate. You see what I'm saying? With what the world of many perspectives offer, not interdisciplinarily, because then you could say, I am this, you're that, but let go, literally do what Kierkegaard called a teleological suspension, a leap. So he has to be willing to go beyond psychiatry for the sake of reality, go beyond philosophy for the sake of reality, go beyond literature, beyond all the disciplines for the sake of reality. Because when it's all said and done, if colonialism were correct, let's just imagine if it were true, then Black people are inferior. Then we should be colonized. Then what's the point of freedom? What's any of that? So ultimately, the demonstration of the lie really opens the door for the possibility of understanding freedom, truth, reality, etc. In other words, going all the way back even to someone like Zara Yacob in Ethiopia, right, the 17th century philosopher, he has to take a position that ultimately freedom, liberation, and truth and reality are one. They meet. And to do that, one has to be critical of the kind of reductionism that would actually close off our relationship to reality. But instead, find a way to write a text that unmasks us and puts us in that relationship. And this is one of the reasons why I've argued the text is a beautiful performance. And it's also clearly a creolized text, and not creolized in the racial sense, mixed race creolized. No, creolized in the methodological sense, in that it is not trying to be pure. It is dirtying its hands to get into the world to deal with what is difficult to face.
In this process of creolization, you highlight the intense intertextual conversations that are occurring in the text. I mean, there's Lacan there, there's Freud there, Manoni's there, whole chapter. I mean, because he's wrestling with his 1952 text, Prospero and Caliban, the psychology of colonization. But there's also the presence of an individual you elevate, this sort of triadic relationship that occurs, that emerges between Richard Wright, Simone de Beauvoir, and Fanon. Talk to us a bit about that relationship that occurs and the inspiration that the Beauvoir's work and how it influences the text.
Sure. Well, one of the things, folks overlook, first, if we begin with Beauvoir, right? When she wrote the Deuxième Sexe, right? The Second Sex, she explicitly acknowledges Richard Wright.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really crucial because you see, Richard Wright, Richard Wright's philosophical mind is grossly underestimated. There are a lot of people, and part of it, again, and it's a lot of Black writers had to do exactly what Fanon was doing. Because Du Bois, as you know, and did this, Anna Julia Cooper did this. There's so many. Nell Larson, the list goes through. The challenge of the very idea that we think already put us in a very strange relationship. I talk about it when I talk about philosophical anthropology. If someone says you're not a human being, and you say, what are you talking about? I'm as human as you are, you'd have lost, because you'd have made the person who challenged your humanity the standard. Mm-hmm. Well, similarly, if there are people who say you can't think, you don't think, if you say I can think as well as you can, who says the person who challenges your ability to think is a de facto example of excellent thinking? So that means you gotta think in a different way. And this is something we know go all the way back. You can even see it in Wheatley, right? There's so many, Anthony Firmin in Haiti. And so the thing with Richard Wright is Richard Wright, in many ways, found a way to bring really troubling questions to the fore. And one example is when Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Richard Wright and Beauvoir were hanging out. But Sartre had asked Richard Wright to tell him about the Black problem. And, Wright said, there ain't no Black problem. There's a white problem. You know what I mean? And that's where Sartre realized it's not a Jewish problem, it's the anti-Semites problem. But within the framework, Richard Wright encouraged Beauvoir to say, it's not women are the problem. It's the problem of constructing women as a problem, right? You could see that Du Boisian riff going. And Beauvoir was thinking what Richard Wright, Beauvoir, and Sartre met on is a profound commitment to the complexity of freedom. You see, there are people who confuse liberty with freedom. Liberty just means an absence of constraint. But you could be a schmuck with an absence of constraint. In fact, you could be so locked into selfishness that you're even a greater slave because you fail to grow in your responsibility to your fellow human being. So they began to understand the responsibility of freedom. And Beauvoir says this radically in the Ethics of Ambiguity. She says, I was thinking the French, but I figured, let me just go through to the English, right? And what she basically argues is that freedom is relational and situational, which means that it has a dialectical quality and it's developmental. And so she looked at Descartes' notion of the idea of the child, right? A lot of people don't know, there's some good work on this problem. A lot of people don't know the concept of the child is a very recent phenomenon. Humanity didn't used to think about childhood. But Beauvoir understood the idea of a developmental freedom. In other words, freedom is not something you have, it's something you work at. And she formulated the tragedy of the man, as she put it, is that he was a child. And within that framework, Fanon erroneously, for whatever reason, ascribed it to Nietzsche, but it was with Beauvoir. And Fanon, particularly, is a relational thinker about freedom. And what he, through Beauvoir, because he knew her, he was in conversation with her. He met Richard Wright, at the Black Writers Congress, knew Sartre, knew all these folks, and what he began to argue in that dialectical understanding is that, you see, a human being, human reality is not from the logic of what we call contraries. Contraries are two universals: universal positive, everything outside of it, universal negative. That means nothing meets. And the insight that Fanon adds to this is the dialectical understanding that to be a human being is to meet. And in every meeting, there's an opening. There's not a closure. It's not the kind of old, thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. And in that, what Fanon brings out is that the project of colonialism, apartheid, Jim Crow, all of that, is to create a lie imposed upon the human world, contraries, separate. But that dehumanizes. It's right. If one is going to break that down and unleash freedom, it requires interaction, connectivity, and it's dialectical because no human being is a god. So your interaction with another human being, if it's to close, then it's violence. If it's to open, it's a dialectical possibility. And this is something Beauvoir, not only there, but in the works, but in Ethics of Ambiguity, she closes with a meditation on freedom. And this is a really crucial thing because Fanon, if one reads the text carefully, he never actually argues in a reductive way of race. For him, race, sex, sexuality, and gender are all dialectically interconnected. But it's colonialism want to reduce them in such a way that ultimately it creates these things. And some of it, you could see that in the French, in the English, a lot of people, some people like to say the black man and so forth, but they don't realize black in French is in the feminine, it's la noire. It's just that in French, if you want to use the semiotic marker to say the black, right? When you put in that abstract noun, you say le noir. And I've been arguing with translators. It's properly talking about the black, the white, and then tease out. When he means black female, black male, he's specific. But within that framework, freedom, the idea that you could have non-relational freedom, that you could be free by yourself. Fanon, Beauvoir, Richard Wright, all of that is nonsense. We live in a social, relational world. We're in a world always that is transcending closure. And that's the richness of the kind of conversations they were having.
We received several questions, and this is a good segue to try to address some of them that really revolve around the political implications of this text. When you mention and discuss Fanon's personal commitment to the complexity of freedom and the way in which he develops it in the text, how would you rather communicate the political implications of this text, recognizing that in the US situation, we get the wretched of the earth, and then we get the translation of Black Skin, White Mask in the late 60s. And of course, in the 80s, it undergoes another revolution in the academy, whereby the political import is dematerialized. And in many ways, Cedric Robinson writes about this, and you write about Cedric's The Appropriation of Fanon that emerges. How would we take this text and understand the profound complexity of freedom as a political project?
Okay, well, since we have a limited time, I'm going to make it short, right? The short answer is this is a book about several things, but one of them is about failure. Every chapter is a chapter on failure, okay? And failure is rather complicated because there's a nuanced way of talking about failure. In English, we just say failure, but in French, you could say raté or échec. And he's talking about the failure to measure up, right? And each chapter, what it shows is every effort to work within a system that is, Du Bois would say this, he's in agreement with Du Bois on this, which is structurally designed to dehumanize you. You cannot, every effort to work within it, to do it by yourself, depends on the illusion that you're a god. The reality is the transformation requires political action. So this, even with Peau Noire Masque Blanc, even with Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon's argument is not apolitical. It's not to go away from the political. It's actually an argument to say, if you do not engage the political, that would make you unhealthy. So it's very different from the way people talk about politics today. There are people who demonize politics like it'll sully you, it'll make you bad. No, for Fanon, politics is healthy. Political life is healthy. And what some people miss, because there's this other, it's a kind of racist epistemology. There are people, when there's a Black thinker, people are always trying to figure out which white thinker is he the application of. Right? So there are people trying to make Fanon Lacanian, Sartrean, Hegelian, the list is long. When in fact, in the text, he's interrogating each of these. Mm-hmm. His argument was with Lacan, as an example, is that Lacan's semiological psychoanalysis, in other words, the psychoanalysis that is based on the legitimacy of language through which sexual difference is produced, presupposes sexual difference as ontologically basic, as the root way of reality. But what Fanon showed, if one reads the text, for instance, the chapters that talk about the woman of color and the white man and the man of color and the white woman, people think it's about interracial relationships, but it isn't. He uses the context to tease the reader in to show that's the problem. The problem is if Lacanianism were correct, then Jean Venus, the man of color in the text, should actually be different from Maid Capacia, whose historical real name was Lucette Sarano, right? But it turns out they had the same logic. They were seeking legitimacy through the words of legitimacy from a white man. So that is not explainable properly, even though it has the form of the Lacanian argument. It transcends, you can only account for it if you add to it the historical reality of colonialism and racism, etc. And so once we see that in all of those chapters, the book ultimately saying, if you imagine that you can actually achieve your freedom by yourself, you are not well. And in fact, what he goes even further, as he goes through these moves, okay? Each of these failures, he shows it even at the level of recognition, that the failure to engage in political action would just simply affirm your degradation. And the book famously ends with a question, okay? And a lot of people miss it. Why does he use the word prayer and question? Mm-hmm. And why is it to the body? Why is it not to God, etc.? Because of course, he said, Black skin. The prayer is to open is to shed, to open, if there is possibility, which is what the question is, then one can move towards freedom. But he has a subtext about freedom throughout the text. See, people want to look at freedom in a reductionistic way. And that's the liberty model, the absence of a constraint. But freedom is about responsibility, maturation, which is connected back to Beauvoir, the developmental side. But there's another thing it's about that a lot of people don't pay attention to. Freedom is about having a home. It's about belonging. And a lot of people confuse domesticity with home. When home is not necessarily about a physical place.
Mhm.
You see, home is about a relationship of belonging. So if you, for instance, find your life partner, love, that's a home. If you find a discipline that you're able to flourish in, to think better in, that's a home. What Fanon throughout the book is exploring is every effort to find a home that was invested in a system that says you don't belong, creates what I would call Black melancholia, right? The idea of a kind of bereavement of never belonging. And if one politically transcends that system, then one takes on the political act of building belonging, building livable worlds, building societies in which freedom, respect, dignity can flourish. So questioning the body is to opening up to enter the social realm of what it is to be able to live in a human reality of human relations. And that, what many human beings forget, as much as there are people say they're anti-humanist, post-humanist, and all that stuff, human beings can only live in human worlds. A lot of us who think we go out to nature, that's a human constructed nature. Real nature will kick our butt. We can't live in real nature. We live in human reality in which there's meaning. Human beings need meaning in which to live. And that's why that question is about the production of meaning. We need to construct, he's arguing at that moment, a decolonized, revolutionary practice of creating livable lives.
You bring up the question about possibility, and really the theme of failure that weaves throughout the text, but in a very complex way. And of course, you call this text a blues text. And being a musician, the blues has a certain resonance.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to us a bit about this text as a blues text and the possibility of reading it as a blues text.
Yeah, no, it's totally a blues text, right? But first I have to explain what I mean by blues. Most people, when they hear blues, they think of blues music. They don't think of more complex phenomena of blues, the way, Amira Baraka, the way Ralph Ellison, many others who talk about blues, right? And one of the things we have to do is not talk about the blues reductively. First, we start about generally with blues. All blues start off with a repetition.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about blues repetition, how can something be repeated but not be the same? That's a paradox. Then blues always gets to another movement. But the other movement is almost always filled with a form of dissonance. We call that, when it's done instrumentally, the blue note, right? The note between the notes. And this is really crucial because what colonialism, what the binary logics do is back to that thing I said before, contraries, black and white, just that. You see what I'm saying? But human reality, there's infinitesimal layers of how to live between those binaries. And beyond that, those blue notes, at that moment, we begin now to communicate those, and we come to denouement, where we come back. And within that structure, although it may re-articulate the beginning, it's not a regular beginning, it's a new beginning because the journey has created a new insight. Now, at the level of content, all blues, there's no such thing as a blues that in which the singer, the author, the poet, whatever, doesn't make a statement about responsibility. There's always a contradiction in which the person doesn't simply say, I'm suffering, but the person also raises the question of agency, right? And sometimes in ironic ways. So we would find, for instance, I mean, I love listening to not only Diane Washington, we listen to Bessie Smith, you listen to Ma Rainey, but there's so many examples of these, because a lot of these women were also, composers. But what we see in the blues is like, when you hear lines like, Daddy, why you so salty? My other men ain't. You see what I'm saying? Or where a woman says, I got juice last night, but I took my man to his wife's front door. Again, it's ironic. There are all these moves. Or if you listen to some Louis Jordan stuff, there are all of these little ironic moments. Now, irony is crucial, because without irony, you don't have your humanity, because it's not simply an articulation of freedom, but an ability to re-articulate an understanding of that freedom. And so in blues, you see, a racist world tell Black people, we're children. We have to be wards of white people. We don't have an adult sensibility. It's no accident Richard Wright ended The Outsider with, after this, he's a protagonist, but a complex figure. He did commit the murders. And when he was asked at the end, is there anything you regret? And he said, I'm pissed off because I'm dying feeling innocent. You see, to be mature, to be adult, to have responsibility, you have to be capable of guilt. And that paradox is in blues. Every blues song says Black people. And it's not really because, right? But we start with Black people. Black people are people with all the capacities of what it is to have mature adult realization of responsibility. Even in the midst of suffering, we can understand that we have agency to bring meaning to our suffering. And it's one of the reasons why blues taps beyond Black people. It's one of the great modern forms. It's why in Beijing, there's somebody listening to the blues. It's why in Auckland, there's somebody listening to the blues. It's why in Greenland, there's somebody listening to the blues. For all we know, in Antarctica right now, there's somebody in a tent doing research listening to the blues. And not just the blues as what we call blues music, because hip hop is informed by the blues. Samba is informed by the blues. If you look at all those, all the way through to what you would find in Afro-punk, Afro-funk, lots of those. You even find blues in forms of Punjabi, Bhangra, etc. Because in the Euro-modern world, whole groups of people were being told we lack the capacity to exemplify our humanity. Blues ultimately says, hell no. We're going to claim our humanity. We're going to assert it and take full responsibility for it. And Black Skin, White Man says all those movements. Failure, failure. Then he does a repetition through L'Expérience Vécue de Noir. That's that moment in the text, which it retells the entire text. Then it goes through to the very end with the question. But if you look at it throughout, it has all the ironic structures of the blues. And so, yeah, I read Black Skin, White Mass as many things: a creolized text, a blues text, all of those. And we got to get rid of the kind of logic that says, almost Highlander style, it can only be one. We have to understand that our creativity and freedom is through the multi-convergence of meaning, and we have the capacity to bring them together, as that, young man did. In his mid-20s, 71 years ago, and he came to Prince 70 years ago.
My final prayer. Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions. Louis, thank you so much for joining us, and thank everyone for all of the questions that were submitted. Sorry we could not get to all of them, but I will make sure we share them with our guests. And we truly appreciate you joining us, Louis, for this 70th anniversary conversation on Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, Corey. Thank you.